I'm Ashton Addison from EventChain for Investmentpitch Media and FinTech News Network. And today on Blockchain Interviews, we have Danny Brownwolf, the Head of Partnerships at Orbs. Danny, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to see you today and great to have you here.
Hey, Ashton, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Let's start by understanding a little bit more about the Orbs blockchain. Could you first explain just the simple solutions on what is Orbs doing in the blockchain industry and how are you guys helping consumer brands?
Of course. So Orbs is meant to be a public blockchain infrastructure for existing businesses. So rather than going after the token economy based dApp that's controlled by a DAO, we go after existing companies, existing tech companies, enterprises, etc., and show them how public blockchain can help their businesses.
That's great. And one of the most popular public networks that uses smart contracts and dApps is the Ethereum network. I know you guys, I believe, are sort of similar to Ethereum in a way, but a little bit different. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So we're similar to Ethereum because of the permissionless aspect. That's what makes a public blockchain public, that anyone can become a node and anyone can participate and anyone can build on it. But different from Ethereum, we are a blockchain that is meant for existing businesses. So there is no tokenization on Orbs, first of all.
Yeah.
And the scalability is completely different. It was built from the ground up for a completely different scale and different use cases, optimized for different use cases. So on Ethereum, one of the biggest problems on Ethereum is actually the lack of isolation for real companies. So let's say you're building an app on Ethereum. As soon as there's a lot of usage, the usage is shared because there's no isolation.
Yeah.
So if CryptoKitties has a 2017 moment, then all of a sudden your app gets slowed down.
Yeah.
Now, go explain that to a CTO of Lyft. It's like, yeah, if the decentralized Uber actually gets hyped up, then you get slowed down, and that's not something that a real business can live with.
Totally, and that's been a major problem with Ethereum. It can only scale so much, and if there was one popular application, the whole network and all of the applications are slow. So it's interesting that you guys have integrated that isolation, and that's great. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit further. Does that have anything to do with the consensus algorithm? I believe you guys are using proof of stake, which is different than Ethereum's proof of work. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And is that what's allowing for more scalability, or is the isolation an extra part of that?
So the isolation is a completely different architecture that we learned by building on Ethereum, how we want to optimize for a different use case. So, I mean, Ethereum, even when it moves to proof of stake, is still not going to have any isolation. So what we did is we took a concept that exists in many networks called virtualization. That's how cloud architecture works, for example. So if you have AWS application, it's completely isolated from the next application. So Netflix working on AWS is isolated from all the other ones, but it's not going to get disrupted by the peak moment of another one. So you have a shared infrastructure, which in blockchain case is the shared node and validator system, but you have a virtualized environment that's your own. So it allows for isolation, but also isolation from security hazard, whether internal or external. So if you think of the DAO bug on Ethereum, if one application has a bug in one of its smart contracts, the fact that there can be a governance decision of the network to roll back the network, as an app developer, I would never, or a business owner, I would never agree to be on such a network. It would be a big problem. And here you have the isolation, and the virtual chain allows for your own governance. So you'll be able to make a governance decision to roll back only your virtual chain.
That's very interesting, because part of the reason why Ethereum is set up like that is they're trying to go for a lot of decentralization and sort of fairness and code immutability, and that's part of the reason why they didn't want to roll back the when there was a bug, they didn't want to roll it back because it was immutable, but they did it anyway. With Orbs, you guys have this isolation. Do you guys care about decentralization, or do you think that's an important part, and is it sacrificed by allowing more governance to each of the enterprises?
We don't think it's a 0 to 1. We think that each use case should be optimized, and therefore it's not the infrastructure's decision to dictate the level of decentralization. There are certain guarantees that the infrastructure has to give, and that's the essence of public blockchain. Those guarantees, we define them as auditability, governance, and forkability. And those are the bases of guarantees that the users and the partners have. But we like to give the bridge between the 0 to 1 and leave it up to the DApp itself to decentralize either over time or to decide that there is only certain level of decentralization that they would allow.
Mm-hmm. I really like that idea where the enterprises, it's their business. They should be able to control more of their own business and grow it the way that they see. And what's funny is traditionally, a lot of enterprise clients have been leaning towards private blockchains like the Hyperledger blockchain or other private blockchains where they only control it. But you guys are more giving them a public blockchain angle and convincing them to go to the public blockchain. This is, totally unique. Can you talk a little bit about how's that been convincing these enterprises, and do they see a lot of benefits doing that?
So I think the example that they understand, first of all, is that they're scared of the absolute decentralization. The ideology behind it scares them, not the actual logistics of it at a first point. So we come to them and say, listen, we are not here to create a decentralized Uber. Okay, we personally also don't believe that there's enough decentralized infrastructure to allow for a decentralized Uber, such as decentralized identity verification for drivers to make sure that they're not serial killers. So what we want to do is come to Uber Ltd and say, you have certain trust problems, or you can provide a better standard and compete on trust that would allow your partners and your users to trust you more. Like, I have a problem as an Uber user with surcharge. Okay, they claim, they give us a promise that surcharge is based on supply and demand, but we don't see the algorithm. We don't see how the algorithm actually works. And then you get all these Twitter, just like explosions saying, oh, Uber is actually raising your price if your battery's low. Or how do we know that, it's their yearly reports are coming in and they want to make more money for the report, so they raise the prices. So blockchain would allow them to only have a certain part of their business as public and transparent and auditable, but what they would be giving up a little bit of control and sending data. But at the end of the day, we believe they'll gain a lot more on competitiveness and creating a new standard for their users that will make them more attractive. So enterprises understand that transparency and auditability and guarantees to users is a way to compete over users in creating new standards. They understand it because, once you start with 30-day back guarantees on products, that becomes a standard across the industry, and the first one that does it wins.
Yeah.
So what the next step is to explain to them why the value is in public blockchain and not in private blockchains, which is the easiest thing for them to do.
Yeah.
And we come in and we say, okay, well, let's identify what is the value of blockchain. Why do we use blockchain? It is more expensive, so it better be worth more, the value that you get out of it. And the private blockchains, Hyperledger, Corda, et cetera, define blockchain as a platform to collaborate. But we've had DLTs and technical platforms to collaborate for over 20 years. They don't need blockchain for most use cases. And even if you do, then it doesn't scale as much because it's not open. And part of the value that blockchain gives is that open source, being able to take open source to the next level. So once they understand that if they need a network effect, plus they need to give those higher level of guarantees to their users, then public blockchain is the answer for them.
That's great, Danny. And with these enterprises, how easy has it been for them to jump any technical hurdles? They think blockchain is this new technology that sounds really confusing. Have you guys made it an easy onboarding process to be able to develop applications on the blockchain without having to learn blockchain 101 and spend years learning how to move to this new kind of infrastructure?
That's a great question. So I think the first thing that we did is decide that we use common languages. So we use Golang as opposed to creating a new language for blockchain. So it's already easier for developers to hop on board. And developer tools, making them as easy as possible and creating libraries is obviously an advantage. But I think a go-to-market that we did was actually come to the enterprises for a 2 to 3 day session with their developers. Because blockchain, it's a new technology. It can be scary. They don't have means, a CTO doesn't have means to assess, okay, you're telling me that this project is going to take 6 months and this much developer power, but I have no tools to assess it. I've never used this technology. So we said, okay, we'll bring our developers to you for 3 days. We'll create a proof of concept together in 3 days, and we promise you'll see how easy it is. And that's worked really well.
That's great. And have you guys already have some large enterprise clients that are running applications successfully? And can you give any examples of anything great that's already live on Orbs?
So the enterprise sales cycle is longer. A lot of them are still under NDA for as long as they're pilots and not in production yet. But I will give one fun example of something that's already running on Orbs that I personally love and is actually going to be developed in the future with enterprises on a larger scale, and that's open rights. So openrights.org is built on the idea of having open access to rights management, content rights management on the blockchain and in the internet in general, specifically for user-generated content. So a lot of the media companies that we work with believe that user-generated content is the future, whether it's of marketing, journalism, etc.
Yep.
And they have a problem with being able to manage the rights. Okay, we like this video that someone made in Hong Kong. How do we access it? How do we use it? How do we maintain the rights and payment? And blockchain is a perfect platform to do this on a large permissionless scale. And new regulations are actually pushing towards establishing such an infrastructure. I don't know if you've seen, the European Union is like breaking the internet with its regulations. And one of the things that they're doing that's already passed and has to be in effect in 2 years in all the EU countries is the copyright directive, which is the copyright reform that forces platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Google to pay royalties to content providers, like treating it more like a radio station. Okay, you make money off commercials or ads, but the content creators aren't making any money. You'd have to find a way to do some sort of rev share and royalties. Now, the big platforms are saying, how do we even know who owns this?
Yeah.
And creating such a registry is a great solution.
Well, that's a great example. So all the best to those guys, and hopefully you guys have a lot more clients coming in that will actually make blockchain applications that can make a difference in the real world. What is your guys' focus for 2020? Is it just onboarding more clients, and is there more development going on the blockchain as well?
So yes and yes. We're moving forward on a few fronts. So the development of the platform is always ongoing, as well as onboarding new clients, taking pilots and move them into production. There are also new areas that we're going to focus on. One of them is really exciting for me personally is GovTech and NGO tech, because my background is actually not technical. I came to this world from foreign policy, working in the United Nations and in think tanks. And I think government tech in blockchain is very exciting because there are a lot of already mandated transparency in government practices. So if in tech, we have to convince the enterprise that there's a certain paradigm change, that they have to go from closed to open. When you go to governments, they're already mandated to be open and transparent. They just don't do it very well. And one of my favorite use cases, for example, is public procurement. So the OECD identified most fraud in countries happen during the public procurement process, and sending the bids, for example, to a smart contract, them all being encrypted at the same time and decrypted at the same time with no one having access to them, internally or external attacks. All of a sudden you take an existing process and you make it a lot more transparent, but as a result, clean of fraud.
Definitely. That makes sense. Well, we're running out of time, Danny, but I really appreciate you coming on the show today and teaching us a little bit about Orbs. It's been a pleasure having you on here, and I'm looking forward to following up in the near future with you guys.
Thanks for having me.